Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce you Shashi Komuri. He's a remote sensing scientist at the National Ecological Observatory Network in NEON. He's interested in studying the structure, composition, and environmental drivers of vegetation distribution over large spatial temporal scales using remote sensing data. He has experience working with Earth observing data from different sensors, multispectral, hyperspectral, LiDAR, mounted on various platforms, spaceborne and airborne, and collected across different spatial temporal scales to study diverse vegetation types, as crops, tundra, shrubs, and tropical savannas. In collaboration with scientists at reputed government agencies such as NASA, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and the U.S. Forest Service, he has developed and deployed spatial temporal data mining methods for improved understanding of plant structure and composition and enhanced predictive modeling of vegetation productivity. So thank you very much for coming, Shashi. It's a pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining in, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from remotely. Well, firstly, I would like to thank the Earth Lab for giving me this opportunity today to give this talk. I'm Shashi Konduri, as Sabeli mentioned. I'm a remote sensing scientist working at the National Ecological Observatory Network, or NEON, which all of you know, and it's operated by Patel. And for the folks online who may not know about NEON, so we are located very close to the Earth Lab, like literally like right next street. So I've been working for NEON for almost a year now. I've joined like in August last year. And before that, I used to be a postdoc at NASA Goddard. I was working with Dr. Doug Morton, and we were interested in using spaceborne LiDAR to detect changes in vegetation structure post fires. And we did this work in Brazil, in the Cerrado biome. I know this is a topic of interest for many here in Earth Lab, so I did have a slide about that at the very end. But today's talk is not going to be about that. So this work is actually the final chapter of my PhD dissertation. Here we are trying to create a high-resolution map of vegetation types for the Alaska low Arctic tundra, and we used a two-step scaling approach, going from plot level to landscape scale to regional scale, and then also projecting changes into the future. So this work was, just to give a brief background about how we got into this work. So this project was supported by the NGEE Arctic project, which is supported by the DOE, and I'll be talking more about this in the next slide. So a lot of my PhD was spent working at Oak Ridge National Lab in Tennessee. I spent close to like 3 years working there, and this was one of the projects I worked on. Even though I'm the one presenting this work, this is truly a joint collaboration of multiple scientists. In fact, all the names you see on the screen right now, most of them are on my PhD committee there. Amy Breen, she is a professor at University of Alaska. She's our lead field ecologist on this team, and so is Verity Salmon and Colleen Iverson. Both of them are scientists at Oak Ridge. In fact, Colleen is the director now of the NGEE Arctic project. Bill Hargrove and Jeetu Kumar. Bill works for US Forest Service, Jeetu at Oak Ridge. They're both remote sensing scientists on the team. And then my PhD advisor, Arup, is an expert in AI machine learning. And Forrest, who was my mentor at Oak Ridge, he's like an Earth system modeler. So you can already see this is an interdisciplinary group of scientists working together. So this is a fun project that I got an opportunity to work on. So talking a bit more about the NGEE Arctic project. So this is a US DOE supported project to improve our understanding of the Arctic ecosystem processes. So this is a joint collaboration between different national labs and also partner research universities like University of Alaska Fairbanks. And each of these, so every summer, we send a huge team of scientists going to Alaska, and we collect a whole bunch of observations, we perform experiments, and then synthesize data sets, and all the knowledge that is gained from those experiments is then incorporated into the DOE's own Earth system model called the E3SM, or Energy Exascale Earth System Model. So the next couple of slides will be a quick introduction about why we are interested in this problem. So the Arctic is growing at an accelerated pace compared to the rest of the globe. In fact, a lot of studies have shown that warming is happening at 4 times the rate of the global average. And these changes are, so this accelerated warming is then causing a whole bunch of widespread changes across the Arctic. One of the things that's been noted is an overall greening trend across much of the Arctic, accompanied with some instances of browning here and there as well. Another change that's been of huge significance is the thawing of permafrost. So permafrost is a layer of frozen ground. So because of all the warming, it's starting to thaw. And what it does is it's sort of accelerating the microbial respiration, which feed on all the organic matter that was frozen until now. And then the respiration is then releasing copious amounts of methane and CO2 into the atmosphere, which are potent greenhouse gases. So there are these multiple positive feedback loops that are existing in the Arctic, which is causing all this accelerated warming. And this is a cool graphic from a paper by Isla Myers-Smith et al. In 2011, which got published in Environmental Research Letters, where they are trying to figure out how an increased density of cover of shrubs and density of shrubs is likely to affect a whole bunch of other ecosystem processes. And the red arrows here show positive relationship and the blue ones show a negative relationship. So for example, an increased shrub cover is likely to affect the atmospheric CO2 concentrations. It's going to change the surface albedo. And then taller shrubs are going to have longer roots that go deeper into the soil, which is then also going to affect the permafrost underneath. And then there's also a whole bunch of other ecosystem disturbances like fire, thermokarst formations, which are affected by vegetation. So there's a lot of stuff happening there, complex relationships everywhere. So if we want to understand the impact of climate change on these ecosystems, then it is essential to have a good idea of the distribution of vegetation on the ground, right? So that leads us to the question. The existing vegetation maps for the Arctic are fairly coarse. So we have the Circumpolar Arctic Vegetation Map, or CAVM, which is available at a 1 kilometer spatial resolution. And then specifically for Alaska, we have an AKEVT map, which is created using Landsat data, which is again at 30-meter resolution. But these maps are not fine enough to capture the heterogeneity that's found on a landscape. It's not that higher resolution maps have not been created. There are studies recently which have flown drones over watersheds in Alaska and created centimeter scale maps of plants. But then the problem with drone is all the logistics involved. You can only fly the drone over such a long area, right? You can't cover vast expanses. And then, yeah, so there's a whole bunch of logistical stuff involved. So the goal of the study is somehow, can we bridge this gap? Can we create a map of vegetation types, which is fairly high resolution, but at the same time also covers a large area, right? And then, so our goal here was to scale from plot level to peninsula level, and also come up with possible projections for the future. So we used a 2-step scaling approach, and I'll be talking more about that in the next slides. So we broke this down into 3 objectives. Our first objective is to create maps of vegetation types using airborne hyperspectral remote sensing, so thereby bridging the gap from plot to landscape. And then in the next step, the inherent problem of remote sensing based mapping is you can only create a map for a place you flew over, right? If you did not fly over a place, you cannot create a map. But then how do you bridge those gaps? But I actually want a map which is much larger in scale, where you did not fly. So how do you create a map for that? So we used a concept of environmental niche modeling, where we are trying to predict what is the most likely vegetation type to grow on the ground, given the local environmental conditions there. So if I tell you the slope, aspect, soil moisture levels, the climate there, the temperature, how much it rains at a given pixel on the ground, can your model tell me what is the most likely vegetation type growing there? Remember, I'm using the word likely. I can only guess what's the most probable. What actually grows there is a different thing. So again, so you can use this approach and then scale from landscape to regional scale. So now we use climate data in our niche modeling approach. The advantage of that is you can simply swap the present day climate with future climate. And now you can get estimates for how the landscape might look like in the future. So how does it change between now and 2050 or 2100? Right? So those are the three objectives we are trying to tackle here. So moving on to the first one, where we're trying to go from plot to landscape using airborne hyperspectral imagery. So just to give a quick background about our study area here, the NGEE Arctic project has sites in the Seaward Peninsula region of Alaska, which represents the transition between boreal forest to tundra. And it also has sites way up in Barrow, Alaska, which is like totally into the tundra area. So tundra meaning treeless in Finnish, I believe. So yeah, you don't really find trees, a whole lot of them in the Barrow area, but you do find a few trees here in the Seaward Peninsula. So the project set up, they selected 3 watersheds in the Seaward Peninsula, shown here in A, B, and C. And these insets are like magnified views of A, B, and C. The 3 watersheds are Cougar Rock, Council, and Teller. And they set up a total of 98 field plots. And the circles here represent the position of those plots. And we sampled a total of 12 plant communities as shown in the legend. And the color of those circles are, based on the plant type that they sampled there. So in addition to these 12 vegetation types, we figured there are 4 other land cover classes which are fairly abundant on the landscape, like forest types, water, and rock. So we also sampled those from Google Earth. And just so we get our semantics right here, so vegetation type is what we are trying to sample, which is a collection of plant species which form a relatively uniform patch. And that figure on the left is an example of a field plot we set up. The size of the plots depend on the nature of the vegetation we are sampling. So taller tree or taller shrubs will have a larger plot sizes, but this here is like 2.5 meters wide. And then this is an example of a vegetation type we sampled. So in this small field plot itself, you see 3 different species: ericaceous shrubs, lichen, and birch. So we group them together because our remote sensing data is not fine enough to capture individual species, so we had to aggregate them to the level of a vegetation type. So similarly, these are plot photos for all the 12 vegetation types we sampled across those 3 watersheds. And these are just photos from a field survey that I was a part of. This was back in summer 2019. We visited those 3 watersheds, and then we collected data about the plant community type found there, the GPS coordinates for these 4 plot corners, as shown by arrows here, as well as the plot center, and then the vegetation height, active layer depth, a whole bunch of experiments performed there. So that's me in the top right corner, top left corner, with Verity and Colleen, my co-authors. That's Forrest holding a whiteboard there. Yeah, fun times. So that was all about the plot level data we collected. Now moving on to the remote sensing part. So NASA, as part of the above program, above stands for the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment. They fly their hyperspectral sensors over a few watersheds in Alaska. So this one uses the Avris NG sensor. And by the way, this is the same sensor we use at NEON as well. Exact same. Except that we fly the plane at a lower altitude, so you get a slightly better resolution. So their data is available at 5 meters. Whereas NEON data has a resolution of about 1 meter. But that also means that our flight lines are probably thinner than theirs. So this one is a compromise. But everything else is the same. The wavelength range is the same, number of bands, everything same. And part B shows that these flights were conducted over 3 years, 17, 18, and 19. They were supposed to be doing it in 2020, but then COVID happened, so they had to abandon that. And part C shows an example of a hyperspectral signature for one of the plant communities or vegetation types. Now, this is where you see the benefit of using hyperspectral. You have like 400 bands, 425 bands, whereas if you download satellite imagery, like Sentinel or Landsat, these tend to be like multispectral, so you probably have what, 10 bands or so, tens of bands at least. So a lot more information here to process. And then, yeah, the blue highlighted areas you see in this figure, these represent the areas which were affected by water vapor interference. So we have to drop them. So out of the 425, we were left with about 370 odd bands, as you can see in part D. So the reflectance values of all of these 370 bands were used as inputs to a machine learning model. In this case, we used a deep neural network, which would predict what vegetation type is growing on the ground. So that's essentially what our model is trying to do here. So we have a total of about 1,500 spectral signatures in our data that we extracted from all those plot corners and the plot centers. We split it into 80-20 for training and testing. And then one of the things to remember here is that there are a lot of bands in your input data as shown in part D. So there is likely to be a lot of autocorrelation between these spectral bands, right? So in our neural network, we included a dropout strategy and an L1 regularization, which sort of tries to reduce the number of bands and sort of reduces or takes care of the multicollinearity problem that might exist in the data. And finally, we tested it on the independent test set, and our accuracy was over 93%, which is actually quite good. So once the model was trained, we then deployed it over the entire flight strip that was collected for those watersheds. And then we ended up with these maps of vegetation types at 5-meter resolution. Again, the circles here on these plots represent the locations of our where the field sampling was conducted. So once we created these maps, the first thing, it's one thing to say that, hey, my black box AI model was 93% accurate, right? It's a whole other thing to actually ensure that it makes sense, right? So the first thing we did was we showed these maps to our ecologists who have been to the landscape several times just to see if they agree with some of the patterns that they're seeing. And this is a graphic from another simultaneous work that was going on in NGEE Arctic project, where they are trying to improve the representation of vegetation in Earth system models. So just to take a sidestep here, and for folks online, I've been told that this is a fairly interdisciplinary audience. So just to explain, an Earth system model is basically a collection of really complex equations which try to model the whole planet. And you're trying to model every component of it: atmosphere, oceans, the cryosphere, biosphere, all of it. So right now, in the older versions of this E3SM model that DOE developed, the entire diversity of Arctic vegetation was represented using just 2 PFTs, grass and shrub. That's it. So the goal of this paper was to increase that number of PFTs from 2 to 9. So this graphic that you see on the screen represents all the knowledge that this project gained by visiting these watersheds multiple times, just to get an idea of which type of vegetation communities are expected across different surface elevations, right? So what I figured out was low elevation areas tend to be dominated by tussock tundra. That's what TT represents here. So these tend to be places with very gentle slopes, where the water sort of enters laterally and the soil is in near saturated state. So the shrubs can't really grow here. The shrubs really like to grow in the mid elevation areas where the soils are well drained. The soils are also deeper, so the roots can go deep into the soil. And then there's a lot of snow that gets blown over from the hilltop and gets deposited here. And snow in the winters acts as an insulator. So it protects the vegetation from really cold from cold temperatures. So shrubs like to grow in the mid elevation areas, and then the hilltops tend to be have really harsh climate. So not a lot of vegetation can grow there. So anyway, so this was lessons we learned by going there. So do our maps that we created here show the same patterns as what we have found on the ground? So what we did was we overlaid our maps on top of the local terrain, the 3D terrain, And then we were interested to see if we see certain patterns. Does certain vegetation try to or have a preference for higher elevation versus mid elevation versus low elevation? So we sort of divided our entire landscape into 5 elevation classes, 0 to 100, 100, 200, going all the way to 500. And then we are trying to see the percent area occupied shown on the y-axis across each of these elevation bins. And we see some of the same patterns which we expect to see. So the yellow is the tussock lichen tundra. That's the TT I showed in the previous figure. You'll see that the abundance of tussock tundra goes down as you go higher up in the elevations. And then shrubs sort of tend to have a preference for the mid elevation areas. The abundance is going up and then going down again. And then as you go higher up in the altitude, you see the gray is really trying to dominate. That's all the barren area which you see typically at the top of a hill slope, right? And then there are certain communities which have a preference for higher elevations, which are also grouped in this barren category. So the whatever these 2 colors are. By the way, if you stare at them for too long, you might go colorblind. I know I did. Yeah, so long story short, the patterns which we actually see on the ground are also being replicated here, which is a nice way of validating the product we created. So that was the first step, going from plot level to landscape. So now is the more challenging step, which is going from landscape to region. And then I mentioned earlier, the problem with this approach is you can only create maps for the places you flew, but now we want to create it for the whole region. And then we use niche modeling approach for that. So this is what we have in the top left corner. We don't have airborne remote sensing for the whole region, but what we do have instead are a whole bunch of environmental data sets, like elevation, which you get from a DEM. And then you can derive a whole host of other variables like slope, aspect, and others. And then what we are doing is we're using these environmental data sets as inputs to a niche model. In this case, we used a random forest model as our niche model. And then again, it's the same task of classification. It tells you what's the most likely land cover type that's likely to exist at that pixel on the ground based on the local environmental variables. And then we end up creating a habitat suitability map, again at 5-meter resolution. So the black area in this map is what we started out with, and this whole thing is what we ended up with. And then this model, when tested on an independent data set, was around 70% accurate. So this is not too bad. Again, we are calculating this accuracy by comparing what the model thinks is the most likely vegetation type with what is actually found in those maps that we created in the previous step, right? I mean, just based on environmental data, I mean, a 70% accuracy is not too bad. So these were the variables we used for that analysis. So this list was actually a lot bigger when we started out. We basically downloaded every data we could and threw it at the model just to see what it does. So kitchen sink approach, as some might call it. But then as a common saying, garbage in, garbage out. So if your input data is not good enough, you will not be able to get good results. So anyway, so what we ended up using was, most of it was topography related. So we have a 5-meter DEM for the whole Alaska. So if you have information for elevation, you can calculate slope, you can calculate aspect. This was one interesting variable, topographic wetness index. Ideally, we needed soil moisture. We can't get gridded data sets for soil moisture, unfortunately. So what we ended up using was a proxy for soil moisture, which you also calculate from the DEM, which essentially tells you if it were to rain on a given landscape, where is the water most likely to get accumulated? You can say that simply based on the DEM, right? So it's a proxy that's being used in previous studies, so we decided to go with that. Again, distance to stream is another important variable. How close you are to the stream determines the soil moisture there, and how much solar radiation you're receiving at a given point. For climate, we only decided to go with temperature. Initially, we included precipitation as well, but then these are downscaled climate data. So these are modeled climate data coming from Earth system models, which are then downscaled to a higher resolution. And then what we found was temperature downscaled products were more credible, more reliable compared to the precipitation ones. There was just a lot more noise there. So we initially, although we included that, we then decided to remove it later on. Yeah, so once our model was trained on those flight strips, then we went on and deployed it at a much larger regional scale. And then random forest also has this really cool feature, which all of you probably know, where you can also estimate the variable importance. And then what we saw was that our temperature, our climate data, and elevation seem to be the most important variables, and these two are also likely highly correlated. You expect elevation and temperature to be correlated. So this also kind of is a good validation for a similar result that was found for earlier studies, where at a regional scale, climate tends to be a major factor affecting the vegetation. But if you go on, zoom into the local scale, then topography starts to play a role as well. So that result is also kind of shown here. So that was the objective too, from going from landscape to region. Now, so these were your inputs to your niche model. Now the temperature we used for the previous step was a present day climate. Now, if you swap this present day climate with future projections of climate, then you might end up with a different looking map, which might tell you how the landscape might look like in future, right? So that was our objective 3 here for the study. So what we found was once you swap those present day climate with future and rerun the model at the regional scale, the x-axis shows the decadal projections. So we're going from 2010, 2019 through 2050 to 59. And then the y-axis measures or shows the percent area occupied by the vegetation types across the whole region. And you'll notice that the green is sort of taking over everything else. So the shrub cover is expected to grow up substantially by mid-century. And then it's also happening at the cost of other vegetation types. So the yellow you might see is actually going down. So that's a graminar tundra. So the lichen cover is expected to go down as well. And then these changes are also, there are changes expected to happen across the elevation gradient as well. So we talked about the elevation gradient earlier, right? The composition is expected to change based on which elevation band you are in. So we want to see what happens across that gradient in future. So the central map this map here at the center you see is the elevation map for the whole region. And we stratified it into like low elevation, mid elevation, and high elevation areas. So let's start with the high elevation. You'll see that in the present day. So I've also mentioned provided the elevation contour lines for the hill slopes. So in the present day, we have the shrub cover up to, I don't know, 250 meters here. But then in future, it sort of moves northward, moves up the hill slope to maybe even 350 meters. So that's what's expected to happen in high elevation areas. In mid elevation, again, shrub taking over and what looks like places close to the streams. And then again in low elevation areas, so areas below 50 meters, again, the lichen cover, the tussock tundra being completely taken over by shrubs. And these results are something that also agree well with findings from other research studies, which have also shown in the Western Canadian Arctic shrub expansion and the lichen decline. This was in ecosystems, and there was another paper which showed Russian Arctic also is experiencing greening, and that's closely tracked by the shrub willows. So shrub cover greening across much of the Arctic, something that the previous studies have also shown. So yeah, just to summarize here, we bridged spatial scales in the study, going from plot level to landscape to regional scale, using a two-step scaling up approach. And then the advantage of using this niche modeling was that you could then swap out the present day climate with future and then come up with future predictions. Now, I want to spend some time talking about the challenges I faced while doing this work. And I'm sure you'll have some inputs on that as well. The first challenge with using a niche modeling approach is that if there are vegetation types that grow in similar environmental conditions, your model is likely to get them wrong. So I showed you this graphic before, where there are a whole bunch of shrubs which are growing in the mid elevation, and then if your model is trying to predict trees apart one from the other, it's likely to get it wrong most of the time. So to address that issue, what we did was we sort of grouped our vegetation types into broader categories. So all these different shrub-like vegetation types were all put in one category called shrub tundra. And then same approach for graminard tundra, barren, etc. So that sort of reduced our problem to some extent. Yeah, and then another thing to keep in mind when you're using these models is that these models assume that the training data cover the entire possible gradient of growing conditions for each vegetation type. So if you're sampling in such a way that you're only sampling from a small portion of the next space that the vegetation type actually occupies, then your model will keep under predicting that across the whole region. So that is something to keep in mind when you're using these models. And this is a very well-known thing. The credibility of statistical models and machine learning models goes down when you're presenting them with novel conditions that they were not trained on. And this is true for both space and time, the left and the right. So in terms of space, so the left figure, the black strips are the area where the model was trained on, and then you have to decide how far do you want to go in space. You can technically go as far as you want. You can go circumpolar Arctic. Your model will always keep predicting one of those 16 classes every time. So these models are kind of dumb in that sense. But if you go too far, there are two problems happening. One, if your model was only trained to predict one of the 16 classes, and if you encounter a 17th class, it will make a mistake. And second problem, your model was trained on a certain combination of environmental variables, certain combination of slope aspect, elevation, climate. If you go into a completely new area which has a new combination of these, the model again does not know exactly what to do and may make mistakes. So we decided this extent for a regional scale based on discussions with ecologists on our team. They were like, okay, this is how far you should go. If you go any far further, then you might make mistakes. Your model might make mistakes. So that was the spatial component. The temporal component, we also made projections for the future. So the question is, how far into the future do you want to go? So here on the right, we created box plots for the climate model projections. And we see that around the 2050, 59 decade, this is when the distribution of temperature starts to look very different from the training period, right? The box plots are like completely looking different. So these again represent novel conditions for the model to make projections. And we decided to cut it off here. And we didn't make any projections beyond 2050 because we thought they would be less credible. Something to, again, to keep in mind. And then this is the biggest and most important of them all. So I mentioned this paper is in peer review and it has already received reviews from multiple reviewers, and they all pointed out the same thing, that you are not including a lot of environmental data that are known to affect vegetation distribution. So I mentioned precipitation, and there were other variables which are also coming out from the Earth system models like growing season length. So there were two issues. One is low accuracy of downscale products, especially for precipitation. And then some of these variables like growing season length are highly correlated with summer temperatures, so we decided to not include them. And then this is another problem. The lack of gridded data sets for the study area. So we know that variables like how deep is the active layer, or soil properties like soil nutrients, soil moisture, snow cover, pH, thermocast, fires. There's a lot of things we know affect vegetation, but we just don't have the data for it. So we had to just settle for those few variables that I showed you earlier. So as I mentioned, this project NGEE Arctic is supported by the US Department of Energy. And then, I also wanted to talk about how users could use NEON data to do similar kind of analysis. So even though we did this for the Alaskan region, you can pretty much do a similar kind of ecological scaling up kind of work for pretty much the entire United States, and that includes Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. And I'll explain how. So the NEON domains were created based on a multivariate geographic clustering algorithm. So what you're doing is you're taking in a whole bunch of historical climate data, topography data, soils data, all of that. And then you're creating ecoregions or regions which are ecologically similar, right? That is what these domains represent. And then for each site, NEON collects a whole bunch of automated instrument data, observation sampling, aquatics data, and a whole bunch of stuff. So this represents the plot level data that NEON provides. And then the AOP, that's the remote sensing wing of NEON, collects data that encompasses all of these plot level data. So this sort of represents the landscape scale, so to speak. So you're going from plot to landscape, and then these domains individually represent the regional scale, right, which have similar kind of environmental conditions. And another thing to mention here is the location of each of, in case you're wondering how did they come up with the location of these individual sites, is these locations represent, so they have the most representative climate for the whole domain. That's how those locations were chosen. So this entire structure was created to enable such scaling up studies. So, and this is not just restricted to vegetation type mapping, but you could pretty much scale whatever ecosystem variable it is you're interested in. So I wanted to also mention that. Yeah, I mentioned earlier, I also had some experience working with LiDAR data. So yeah, in case if you are interested in that, we can also talk about it after this presentation. Yeah, that's all I have for today. I hope I didn't go over time.
Thank you. Anyone here? Questions?
I have two questions. First one is about mid-domain effect. So I noticed that your model didn't have dispersal in it. And there's this tendency on mountains for species diversity to just be the highest at the mid elevation because dispersal is bouncing things around and you're getting this like spatial process. So that's one example of a spatial process that we could add here. Can you just talk about generally spatial processes, how they play or don't play well with your model, and specifically when you're thinking about elevation, how might the mid-domain effect play into future projections?
Yeah, that's just one process out of several others which we did not include in this model. Dispersal is certainly one of an important variable. I think there's been some progress made lately about incorporating process into machine learning models. That's something is what most people are working on these days, is how can we make these models intelligent or learn ecology, right? Because right now it's simply a statistical model, it's just learning everything from the data. So yeah, maybe we can tweak the objective function somehow in that machine learning model, which also takes care of these ecologically relevant information, right? Like conservation of mass, conservation of energy, or spatial dispersal mechanisms. All of that stuff represents process of physics. So I think there's been some progress made on that lately, but yeah, there's a lot that needs to be done because again, there's so many limitations when you go far out into space and time, when your model does not understand all the processes. So yeah, something to consider.
Yeah. All right. So my second question, I guess, is sort of about then the training. So you said you had 1,500 training sets, and that went into about what 17, 18 categories.
Yeah, 16, yeah.
But that means we have, something around like 100 datum per classification.
Not even that, because remember you have to divide into training and testing.
Yeah, exactly.
Even less.
And so then we keep stacking these layers of abstraction, but we go down and there was probably pretty high variance in that original sample of 1,500. It feels like we need more, but I don't know how much more or what we need as that base layer of training. Like how big of a base layer of training do we really need to be able to build up this scaling stack of abstraction?
Yeah, the rule of thumb is that your observation sample should be a lot greater than the number of classes you're trying to predict. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the more the data, the better the model performance. But what we have.
Yeah.
Right. But this is correct. And your model architecture should be such that it is able to deal with these issues. And random forest has been shown to be fairly robust to low sample data and high dimensional data. And so is the case with neural networks as well, the architecture we use. But these models are also highly data hungry. So the more data, the better the performance, yes. In fact, what we saw was, I mentioned we had flight line data for 3 years. Initially, it was just 2. And the moment we added the third year, the model performance went up significantly. So the best improvements happen. The easiest way to improving a model is throw more data at it, rather than using complex, fancy architectures or deepest neural network you can find. That won't lead to a significant improvement in accuracy as much as data does, is what we learned. Yeah, we would really appreciate more data, but that's the problem, right, with Arctic. It's traditionally not as data rich as the continental US.
Yeah, but when it comes to making the inference, you made the inference that comes out of your whole process is that it was elevation. But if we sort of start from small sample sizes and then like most of the predictor variables, 9 out of the 10 predictor variables are all topology and only one climate, there's sort of only one conclusion you could come up with, which is that it's topology.
Well, climate actually was also an important factor.
Yeah, but there's only one way for climate to be represented. Right?
Yeah, in this case, our only credible source of climate data. So we do have like weather stations across these 3 watersheds. But the problem with weather station is you get point data, right? And then you can't train a machine learning model using just point data, right? You need a gridded data set, a gridded raster over a much larger area. So that's why we were forced to go for a modeled climate data. But then Earth system models predict it at several kilometers of resolution. Then you downscale it. That has its own uncertainties. But then we still decided to go for it because it at least gives you a consistent base between the present and future. The same model is predicting the present climate and the future climate. Whereas if you use station data for the present and model data for future, that might again cause biases in your results. So yeah, there were a lot of considerations we had to make, and this was the best we could do with one.
Oh yeah, it's great.
Yeah, and then yeah, there's certainly more room for including more climate data, as you said. So certainly, well, if we could get really good quality precipitation data, soil moisture is something important, and snow cover. Snow cover affects this area a lot because more snow means more insulation, more protection for plants. So that also affects. But then we don't have good quality data.
Yeah.
I've not been following the chat box here. I don't know if there are any questions. No? Okay. I'm sure that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Shashi, I guess beautiful work. I really like it. I guess the question here actually likes the projection in time. So you need like data that correspond to the space, but also in time for doing the projection. So I'm thinking on the other layers, they are mostly like static layers. So
yeah, you're right. So these were all the variables we used in the model. And we simply assumed that the topography is going to stay the same, static between now and future. But in reality, that's not good. I mean, that's not the case because permafrost degradation is expected to cause some subsidence in the land. So the topography might change between now and future. But for this research, again, we assume that to be a constant. The only variable here is the mean summer temperature.
Yeah.
Right? That's the only thing that's changing between now and the future. And we would ideally want to include more data, more variables, but we just went with this for now. And that too, it's coming at 700 meter resolution. It's downscale data as well. So that comes with its own uncertainties. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's great. Congratulations. Very nice.
Yeah.
I don't have a question, but I just want to say that was a really clear presentation. Like,
oh, thank you.
Who doesn't know, a lot about LiDAR and know these things? It was great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've been like I said, this was the final chapter of my dissertation. So I've been working on this for quite some time now. So you also learn a lot about this stuff over time.
Can I ask you about these SAR data? I don't.
So we didn't deal with the SAR data directly. This DEM was created using SAR data. We just downloaded the final product.
Okay.
Yeah. So we didn't really process the SAR data to create the DEM here.
Okay, what is, do you know what is the data like exactly? Because 5-meter data, so it's,
It's a raster data, so every 5-meter pixel gives you the local elevation there.
yeah, but it is, spaceborne. I don't, I'm not sure.
IFSAR, I think, is an, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know much actually how it was created. Yeah, maybe I should Google it. I don't know if IFSAR is a spaceborne platform or an airborne platform.
But the coverage should be spaceborne.
Can you get 5-meter resolution? Because we had SRTM at some
Yeah,
point,
no,
right?
yeah,
But that was 30-meter, right? I don't know.
but there are some GM at 1-meter resolution for Conos, for example.
Okay.
I don't know, yeah.
Interesting.
We are hyperspectral ones.
Yeah. You can't, can't get the radio elevations from hyperspectrum. So
No
you
problem.
have to use the LiDAR or radar.
And any suggestion for improving, so I saw that you used it like random forest at the end, like for that machine learning approach. Any suggestion in terms of like other models that we could use for that part?
So we used 2 different models here. So we had a 2-step scaling approach from plot to landscape, landscape to region. We used different models for both.
Yeah.
For the plot to landscape, we used a deep neural network, and at that stage, we also tested a random forest and an SVM, and the neural network gave us the best result.
Yeah.
So we just went with that. And that particular architecture, so L1 regularization and then dropout, taking care of spectral autocorrelation, all of that, that gave us the best results there. For the niche modeling, we used random forest simply because it was a very popularly used method for this purpose in the research.
Yeah.
A lot of papers have used it. We just went with it. And it also takes care of a lot of issues that I mentioned earlier about multicollinearity in the data and having not enough number of samples compared to the number of dimensions. Random forest does a fairly good job at fitting nonlinear relationships, given all those noisy data issues, less data problems, all of that. Plus the fact that it's been used a lot in the past, we just went with it. We didn't really test other models in this case. Yeah, something to maybe also try.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you, Shastri, for
Thank you so
coming.
much.